into, oh, it's 7 o'clock. I need to be quiet. I'm holding myself time accountable. Over to you, Jenny.
Look, I'm delighted for everyone to join us. And for those that have just joined, I'm Jenny Atkinson, and I'll be asking and connecting all the genius that is held within Corey and Nikki today. And we've got the workshop title of Building Resilience, Helping Students Overcome Anxiety and Thrive. Now, just that sentence has so much substance to it, and I know we're not going to be able to cover everything that you're going to be wanting to know and that you're going to want to share, but we're going to make this very real, very practical, and something that you can walk away with and lean on within your school community, and also have a roadmap of some of the opportunities of where you'd like to go to from here. Before we get going, I would like to make an acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land where we work and live. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the land's first storytellers and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'll share a little bit about myself in a minute, but one of the privileges I have is working with some of Australia's best storytellers, authors, illustrators, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And one of the things that I've really leaned into and love is the ability to communicate today that something I loved and really connected with country, and that was the change in the temperature. And it was so cold and my lungs were filled up with this rich, cool air. And then my husband turned on the fire, and the smell of that was something that really allowed me to just breathe it all in and to go through those different experiences. So that's what I'm sharing with you today about what my gratitude is, and simply taking a moment to breathe in the air for both the cold and the warm and the smells. So what I would like to do now is do a very quick housekeeping piece, if I may, Nikki, and lean on you for that, and then we'll jump back into the workshop.
Yes, thank you so much, Jenny. This evening is really about you as well. So we have the amazing Corey here, we have the brilliant Jenny here. But as I mentioned earlier, and if you've just arrived, please bring your questions. We might not get to all of them, but we will make sure that we curate responses, but we will also follow up tomorrow. If you're sort of in and out and you've got things, or you've got young people, or you're busy, this will be recorded and it will be sent out to you. There will be following resources and free resources also sent to you to support the webinar this evening. And any questions that you have, we have a survey. It's not a big, long survey. We are running a lot of webinars, information sessions, and resources throughout National Check-In Week. So if there's something there that you want, you need, or you want more information on, please do let us know, because we do go over all of those, and that survey will only take a second, but it'll help inform us a little bit more. I'll just pass back over to you, Jenny.
Okay, thank you. So tonight, we are going to be talking, and we hear this word quite a bit, about anxiety and the space between what we think we know and what's actually going on. And we're going to explore the science behind anxiety, but also the stories, the real moments in your classrooms, in your playgrounds, with your families, and the conversations where students are not just learning to cope, but learning to understand themselves. And just as importantly, we're going to reflect on the adults in the room, because we're all supporting students. And that doesn't just mean strategies, it means being able to recognise our own thresholds, our own reactions, and our own resilience as well to that. So this isn't about labelling or fixing students, it's about seeing things more clearly. And so we can respond with more confidence. And so that's what I'm hoping today, that you're going to walk away with some more insight, some more knowledge, and some more connections that will make a lot of sense for you and your school community. I'd love to now introduce Corey. And Corey Ackland, listen to this. Like, when I was writing and digesting this, I just went, oh, okay, here we go. So, Clinical Director of Sydney Phobia Clinic, 10 years of specialising in anxiety disorders and phobias, 8 years at Sydney OCD and anxiety disorders practice. You're leading Australia's National Fear of Flying program, PhD candidate in psychology and aviation. You're registered as a clinical supervisor for psychologists, and you've got a rare blend of clinical expertise and real-world insights. Now, Corey, when I read that, I went, right, okay. What it really made me ask is I could never do justice to that expertise. But what I'd love for everyone to hear, and what I'm curious, is to hear the heart behind those things that I've just shared. And could you actually tell us really about you and your story and how you found your calling in work? Because you've just made me super curious about that.
Well, thank you for a glowing introduction. Yes, so I mean, you can tell from my bio that I really am through and through an anxiety lover. All of my career has been working with severe anxiety presentations. And it wasn't my initial goal getting into psychology. I wanted to work as a forensic psychologist, and my path got kind of a bit derailed there after having my eldest son, and then returning to uni thereafter and being mentored by a tremendous man, Professor Rocco Crino, who owns SOCAD practice and OCD and severe anxiety disorders practice. And he took me under his wing as a new mother and early career psychologist. And I haven't looked back. I've loved working in the area of severe anxiety and OCD. And I did work there for, yes, a good 8 years. And along that time, doing some other work along the side, always keeping things varied, consulting, working in drug and alcohol at one point as well. But then I came to Open Sydney Phobia Clinic, and really Sydney Phobia Clinic was born out of some of the frustrations working in the area that I love, private practice, specializing in anxiety, but where we just weren't able to support best practice treatments, which is exposure therapy. And Sydney Phobia Clinic was opened to ensure that we were able to deliver that treatment, deliver as much as we can of that supported exposure therapy in-house. And it was a bit of a gamble, being such a niche private practice, but we opened strong in 2016, and we've been kind of gun blazing the whole way, coming up to 10 years next year. And alongside that, I've been working on the Fear of Flying program. So it's become a joint venture between Sydney Phobia Clinic and Flight Experience Sydney, treating fears of flying, which is a big and ever growing area. As we were talking about traveling earlier, it's something that is just embedded in many people's lives. To not be able to fly actually comes at quite a significant impact. And so it's a very rewarding area to work with as well. And it was through my work on that Fear of Flying program that I had the opportunity to commence and complete a PhD in aviation psychology with UNSW, which I ended up doing throughout COVID, which was an interesting experience. But that's on the other side of that now. And so I'm getting all of my uni fix guest lecturing at NYU. In their Sydney campus, and I'm lecturing in child and adolescent psychopathology. So still, working clinically at the front of mind, but, always trying to go across those different areas.
Amazing. Now, I'm going to jump over to you, Nikki, so I can connect the dots. I know some people really know you well, but there's others that this might be the first time that they've had the delight of your energy and expertise as well. So, Nikki, you're the CEO and founder of Life Skills Go, and supporting student wellbeing with now millions of students using your platform. It's extraordinary. You've also had 20 years of leading social emotional learning in education and tech. And you're known for translating, I really love this bit, of wellbeing data into real action for schools. And I think that is a really powerful sentence that we're going to spend some time on today. For sure, you're mission driven. I know that personally. And that experience, that personal experience, and now the expertise that you bring and the passion is really focused on preventing kids falling through the cracks. That's the simple language I'd like to put around that. And then one of the other fun facts I'd love people to know is the global leadership recognition through Google's Search Inside Yourself program. I also think it's really a fascinating piece. So, Nikki, again, I feel like I can't do the right service to your credentials, but I'd really love to know your personal journey. I think that's something that we'd love to lean into. Could you share your why?
Thanks, Jenny. And I too am blushing. I think you've got this beautiful way of introducing me. I'm like, oh, thank you, Jenny. I think I might just share a story, and it probably is a story to sort of scaffold the work that we're going to, or the dive that we're going to take tonight on the webinar. When I was at school, there was a little boy, and his name was Philip, and he was a really good guy. Wasn't academic, wasn't sporty, wasn't, he didn't sort of fit into those normal buckets. He sort of flew around and was very compliant, and nobody really sort of knew him. But I'm going to make myself, know how old I am now, but we had a thing called the Good League at our public schools, and you could be a Good League leader. And he loved animals, so he was the Good League leader at our school. Anyway, he sort of flew through primary school, got to high school. What people didn't know was he was being parentified, and he was living in a very unsafe home. And, he sort of found areas to go and self-soothe, and he found people to run with that, sort of maybe they just sort of found their own way. By the time he was leaving school, he never actually finished school, but by the time he was sort of 16, he was out, and he was using drugs and alcohol to self-medicate, and unfortunately took his own life. Now, the reason I bring this up is the really tragic part of this story is that was my brother. So myself and my brother, same family, very different outcomes. I often joke that I don't joke that my brother wanted to be a gangster and I wanted to be a nun. I definitely did not become a nun. But within that, within those family, with our compliant behavior, or Philip's compliant behavior, he flew under the radar, wasn't picked up, and there was so much going on that was never seen. I, on the other hand, we often talk about those environments. I, on the other hand, was expelled from schools, bounced around, had very overt behavior, particularly in high school. And yet it was the behavior they were addressing, not really what was going on underneath it. So, without going too deep into my career, I really took it on as a personal mission, very sort of self-centeredly at the beginning. Am I going to be okay? What are those skills and tools? Why am I okay? And why am I living a fairly functional life with a beautiful husband and children and, a career? And so that started this really incredible work from the ground up. And it was at the beginning of really new science and new research and the study of the brain and neuroplasticity, and particularly the study and understanding around social emotional learning. And I've had the privilege of being able to move through my career with all these emerging sciences, whilst also being able to work and test and iterate and ensure that no child falls through the gaps, and that we are able to see every young person. So I'm sure you're not here to hear about me. If you want to find out, you can go and look at it. But we're all here to have a look at how we can better support our young people today. So thank you, Jenny.
Mm-hmm. So that really leads nicely for both of you. I'd love you to share. Yes, you're both deeply connected to schools, to students and families on a daily basis. Can you tell us from your different perspectives, what are you seeing right now? What are you hearing in your communities, in your work?
I'll happily jump
You go
in.
first.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, from a parent point of view, I'm observing my children have a very different experience through school than I certainly ever did. And certainly talking about mental health a lot more than we ever did, which is super pleasing, but also having really unique mental health challenges that were very different to what we had as well. And looking at that, then clinically we're navigating a very different world, and really trying to bring as many tools as we can into the lives of young people who are having challenging times. But with that conversation and looking at mental health a lot more than before, which I think is excellent, we might also be maybe getting very alarmed about mental health. And so that's the balance that we're, clinically trying to straddle, is how do we validate, normalize, but also early intervention and treat, and sort of, really trying to work out when do we rush in? How do we support? When is this a problem? And I know that we're going to be talking a bit more about that today, but that certainly is the clinical question that's kind of going off in my head with most of the young people that I see.
I think I'll probably just dovetail into that, because I don't sit in that clinical medical. I work really in the preventative space. And I think the top level, if I had $1 for every time I heard an educator or a parent or a school talk about, we have huge anxiety problems and we need to build resilience in our young people. And I think that's across the board. And I think that's sort of why we're here. And I really love, Corey, what you were saying about, actually, I'm just going to leave it there. I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure we'll dive right in.
Okay, so with those observations, and it sounds like there's very much a global conversation going on with some really strong common threads. What I really would like to know is, based on what you're seeing, what do we need to understand about what you're seeing and hearing as people that are supporting students and kids on a daily basis?
Look, I think in the context of anxiety specifically, it is important to understand, what it is, when it's a problem, how to manage it, in every aspect that we see it. Even in the normal range, there are still some things that we can do to help it, and then also be able to identify when maybe it's a bit more of a problem and it needs professional help. But education around what it is, why it is, and how we can manage it is always going to be the front line, and that's a frontline conversation for parents, schools. Obviously, we're doing it all the time as clinicians, but these are the things, these are the awareness that we're wanting kids to know, to get through school, and definitely know and understand what's going on in their bodies and their brains.
Can I drill down a little bit on that? Can you share for me, in lay terms, as a non-expert, what's the difference between anxious behaviour versus anxiety?
Yeah, look, and when we're looking at anxiety, we often use it interchangeably with the threat response, and they're all very closely related. Fear, the threat response, anxiety, and really what we're seeing is that anxiety is this triggering of our threat response, of our fear response, or an anticipatory threat response, so worrying about a threat that might be coming up. And so to unpack that suggests a few things. It suggests an interpretation of threat that has occurred, and in particular, one that has overwhelmed the individual's perceived ability or resources to cope, right? And just an example I like to demonstrating that is thinking about, people with spider phobias. People that come into my clinic with spider phobias, they don't often worry too much about redback spiders, because even though we know redbacks can actually hurt us, they're really small. And I think most people think, well, I could squash it before it hurts me, right? So their perceived ability to cope with what is actually a threat means that anxiety response doesn't come up too much. Conversely, what they tend to really freak out about is a huntsman spider, which they logically know, and most of us know, doesn't hurt us. But the perceived ability to cope with a huntsman spider, with its crazy quick movements, and it's usually up high, and means that the threat appraisal, even though it's low, is still overwhelming the perceived ability to cope. And so that's where our threat response comes up, right? That's where that anxiety comes up, where there is this off balance between the interpretation of threat and our perception of coping resources. And so it's also, worth noting that when we're having that threat response, the brain is really motivated to stay safe, right? That we've evolved this response to preserve our survival. And so then the priority is going to be to escape this threatening situation and to secure our safety. And that happens in a really kind of primitive and basic part of the brain, actually, as a priority. So all of our really good thinking and rationalizing and, all of those aspects that we might want to appeal to, they're kind of almost, you could consider them offline. And all the brain wants to do is get to safety. And so that's really what we're seeing when we're looking at then the anxious behaviors. There any behavior that comes out in the brain's attempt to get to safety, or that it has associated with safety in the past that it might then cling to.
Nikki, what would you like to add to that about, that question started off, what would you like us to understand about what you're seeing and hearing?
I think I'm going to answer the question with a question to Corey.
Great.
Sorry, Corey. I suppose because I'm just, in the firing line of schools and educators all the time. And one of the things that I wonder, the question I have, Corey, is how do we begin to say worry or feeling a little bit frightened or like language around anxiety versus an anxiety disorder, and that discernment, because I'm also speaking like a parent as well. So, this is not just, I think it's not just me in my work, but I think language is really powerful, but there's also this fear around when a young person says they're anxious. And, it's a word that young people are hearing and they're using, and I'm hearing a lot more young people using it. But I think that distinction between, and I don't want to take away from your experience, but that would be, if you need more clarity, please ask.
Look, I would answer that by saying that there is, like I alluded to before, there is a bit of a panic about mental health experiences, that when we do experience anxiety or when we hear the word anxiety, and a similar thing is happening around, depression, my mood is low, I'm depressed. There is this panic that comes in that we think, oh, there's a disorder here. There is something that requires medication, that requires treatment. And I'm not to say that can't be the case. Of course, that's the whole area in which I work, but these can also be quite normal experiences and very human experiences. And, anxiety, nervousness, fear, these are very normal experiences. Now, they are hallmark experiences of certain disorders, but they exist in a normal range in and about themselves. And certainly when we're thinking about certain environments that our children are in, they're new environments. Well, new environments quite normally elicit something of an anxiety or a threat response, because we don't know what it is. And if we don't know what it is, we don't know that we're going to be safe. And so there's a little bit of a just in case anxiety, that gets elicited, and that's fine. That's okay. If we have to do some kind of performance, a sports performance, a speech, we know research shows us that some level of anxiety is actually performance positive, right? It gets better performances when we have that arousal. So we certainly wouldn't want to see that reduced. But then we also know that too much of that can be impairing, right? And so even in those kinds of normal ranges, if it becomes to impair our participation, our performances, well, it's something that we could probably manage a bit better and improve. But then when we're looking at anxiety disorders, it's another thing again entirely. And an anxiety disorder occurs when it is a persistent triggering of anxiety in specific situations. It's kind of predictable and habitual in that way. The response is clearly disproportionate to the trigger, and it is impairing. It gets in the way of functioning in any setting. It doesn't need to be every setting, but any setting. And obviously, you know, we're talking today about the school setting. So, you know, it's getting in the way of learning, it's getting in the way of a sense of belonging, it's getting in the way of building relationships.
It was interesting when you were talking there. I'm reflecting on a experience that I had with working with the UN, and we're working on the United Nations with Earth School during lockdown. And I'm looking at the power of language. And the word unprecedented actually created and became a new word with how people felt about it. If we used it in a sentence pre-COVID, post-COVID, it actually has a different meaning. And so we're having a discussion around the program we're doing, and I proposed that we change the word unprecedented to a word that says unfamiliar. And it was a neutralization because we were dealing with students around the world from different cultures, different experiences, and it allowed that moment to be whatever it was for them instead of the media buzz and the language was using. I'm keen to understand from both of you how important common language is, particularly in a school community, particularly at home, particularly in the industry that we work at. What is the role of language and what we understand about? Who would like to jump in on that one? Nikki, maybe?
Okay, I'll jump in there. I think it's a really, you know, I'd probably say and probably expand that out a little bit more. And on my side of the street, that, you know, research and evidence shows that implementing emotional literacy and really beginning to build not only the language but the understanding of identifying and helping young people at a very early age learn to identify, communicate, and then begin to build the tools of self-regulation. The bringing it in a way, and if I sort of think back to, you know, and I won't ramble down all the evidence and the why and how this kind of leads towards, you know, a sense of belonging and all the rest of it. But if we look at our culture, and, you know, Corey, you can kind of poke my eye out with this one, but I think often we've made emotions right or wrong. You know, it's kind of like we've also, you say to someone, how are you? Yeah, I'm great, mate. How are you? You know, that depth of being, you know, really deeply understanding our emotions. We didn't have that back in school. We also didn't have the research, we didn't have the science, we didn't know the why. And what I've seen from schools that have embedded it and brought it into practice every day, and also normalize that it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to throw an apple at someone's head, or it's okay to, you know, feel frustrated or worried, or as you were saying, Corey, that sometimes the energization, the energy that comes from feeling a little concerned and getting ready to, you know, do something on stage is really wonderful. It can be uplifting. I've seen how that really has decreased behavioral incidents, increased a sense of belonging, and really also allowed teachers to connect more fully with their young people. And really, by young people sharing their experiences, there's a closer relationship and there's more trust and safety in the classroom. I'll pass over to you, Corey, because I'm
Look, I would only add that I think that language is really powerful, and it is important that we're able to, you know, teach the just basic labeling of emotions, because, you know, sometimes I get adult clients and that's still work that needs to be done before we can actually get to some therapeutic work. And the big, you know, screaming that's going on in my head and always has is, like, why wouldn't we have got this in schools, right? So, you know, the work that Nikki's doing is just it's just incredible, and it's so valuable, and it's and you know it's always been needed, but you know now especially. But I think the other thing on that is that sometimes you know other language comes in and becomes helpful as well. You know, we use a lot of analogies to help kids understand what's going on for them and help them to kind of, you know, really connect with what's going on. I know for younger kids, I like to use the analogy of the Avengers, and you know, for anxiety, we talk about Iron Man's suit coming on and him blasting off into the sky before he's really been able to assess the threat. Or For anger, we talk about going full Hulk, and you know, and if the kids are familiar with the Avengers, you know, they'll also know that, you know, both Iron Man and Hulk, they needed some help learning how to regulate from others, you know, be it Jarvis, Miss Potts, or Black Widow, before they were able to learn to do that themselves and get a handle of those emotions and help those emotions still be there, but not be reacted to. And so, you know, without being able to appeal to the kids in these ways, and language is absolutely the vehicle to that, we're not going to be able to get to that next stage of doing that work.
Mm-hmm. There's some great questions that are coming through here. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate, right? Talking about language, and it's all sounding really lovely that we can find the right words and we all understand it. But as the adults, either in the classroom or at home, when it comes to modeling and expressing my anger, my joy, my sadness, talk me through about what I can do and can't do, what's healthy, what's unhealthy as a parent. And then I'd love to hear that from a teacher's perspective when you've got different restrictions, different expectations. How do we be what we're talking about to the kids that are looking at us every day?
Yeah, and I think, you know, at the core of that is, you know, children are they're always learning. Well, you know, we're all always learning, but you know, we know that childhood and adolescence is just this tremendous time of learning, and they learn vicariously. They learn through watching. Certainly the younger they are. And so we do want to make sure we're modeling these experiences of having the emotion first and foremost, but also being able to, you know, manage those emotions in adaptive ways. They're not always going to literally be able to see that. So, you know, it is talking about that. You know, I'm really, oh gosh, I'm really nervous about making this phone call. But, you know, I'm just going to take a moment for myself and really think about what I want to say. And then I'm going to make this phone call, and then maybe I'll make a comment afterwards about how that went compared to how I was worried about how it would go, you know, as an example. Talking through all of those stages of having the emotion, you know, doing the thing, and then comparing, you know, of that outcome. But children also learn through practicing, right? So we also want to make sure as parents and as teachers that we're able to provide the opportunities for kids to safely experience these feelings and resolve them with increasing independence, because they're not going to learn, you know, in the moment. We know that when all of those big, huge emotions are coming up in a dynamic situation, as I said, you know, the higher order parts of the brain, not really active. It's not the time for learning. It's not the time for teaching. And so the more that we're setting up opportunities to kind of more gradually, safely have these emotional experiences, and then resolve them, and as I said, with increasing independence, it's quite fine and actually expected that parents would do a lot of supporting of that with younger children. But as they move up through childhood and into adolescence, we want to see parents taking more of a guiding and then more of a back seat, because otherwise their support can actually get in the way of kids learning how to manage their emotions, and that can also have some not great outcomes.
Interesting, just as you were saying that, I was thinking about, you know, I had the privilege to work under Dr. Dan Siegel, and, you know, he used to talk about SIFT, and a lot of the work that we do is, you know, really allowing young people not only to begin to understand what's happening in their brain because they're fascinated by it, like you were saying, Corey, like they just, when they can understand a little bit of what's happening in their brain, it's empowering to them. But also beginning to, and the question was around how do we model that, Jenny? One of the things that we noticed was when we started to model where we felt the emotion in our body and the sensations, because I remember in very, very early days of working with young people in schools, I remember this young person saying to me, "Oh, Miss Nikki, I feel really happy, just like a freshly cut orange through my whole body." And you know, this is probably going back 18 years ago, but I can say this with conviction. I think young people access their somatic experiences much better than we as adults do. The ability, if I ask a young person if they're experiencing an emotion or if they're feeling a little frightened, put your hand on, tell me about it, describe it to me, tell me about your thoughts. Where if I said that to you, Jenny, right now, you'd be like, well, I think I'm thinking, and I'm not saying you're going to say that, but young people, particularly the really young people, are quite often able to access those. So modeling where I'm feeling like I'll be saying, you know, I'm just feeling a little bit of fear because I think I left the blah, blah out this morning, or did I lock the cats? You know, being able to slow down and feel into my body. I also think it's an amazing opportunity for me, and I've seen it through so many adults, to learn at the same time as young people, because we didn't have that opportunity. And I've seen schools that really embrace bringing this in, genuinely getting interested, and then beginning to use like our emotion cards or the emotion check-in, or you know, we get so many messages of, my wife told me that I'm starting to identify my emotions better, because we do it every day, because best practice, trauma informed, we check in, you know, we arrive and we check in, and it makes me smile. Like, it really makes me smile that we might not have had the science, we might not have known the why, but we also have an opportunity right now to join in and to learn new things too.
Mm. Anything you wanted to add to that, Corey, before we move on?
No, that's
Okay.
fine.
So I'd love to really build on that and get into some practical examples. And we've had some through the chat, which is great. And I'm going to lean on a couple of those. Can we take those concepts into, I've got a student who's very anxious around exams. I've got a student that's really anxious about coming to school or uncomfortable about getting into the classroom. I'd love to really build on some of those day-to-day things that are going on that I think the teachers and the parents are both genuinely seeing and concerned about, and going, how do I deal with that in an appropriate way?
Yeah, and you know, the older a child is, you know, as they're getting through to adolescence, then you know, anxiety looks a lot more like adult anxiety, and we've got a little bit more options. You know, we can inquire, you can do a little bit more cognitive work, and we can meet them a little bit more there. When we're going down to younger children, you know, anxiety sometimes looks a little bit different, and it can be harder for children to really report why they're anxious about the situations they're in. You know, it might look like crying, it might look like outbursts, it might just look like clinging to a parent. And in those kinds of situations, I think that the most important thing is to, you know, we're talking about modeling before, is to ourselves take a beat and model calmness, and model that the situation is safe, because here we are feeling safe in that situation. And then, you know, trying to understand if there's additional stresses. You know, a child that's getting anxious about going to school, for example, if that is to do with the chaos of, I mean, I've dropped my kids off at primary school and high school. You know, sometimes it's an absolute zoo walking into those gates. You know, if that seems to be something that is making it more challenging, well, we can accommodate, we can moderate that, we can try to go at an earlier, quieter time, take a different gate, those sorts of things in the first instance. So if there are unnecessary stresses, then it might be reasonable to remove that. And then I think the next really important thing is recognizing what we were just talking about, what's going on in the brain and what the brain kind of can and can't do in that situation. And not trying to treat and not try to over explain, keep things really simple, keep things really brief, reassure safety, reassure security in terms of, you know, here I am with you and we can do this together, we can manage this situation together. And then taking the time, if you've got it, for that person to see that, you know, to learn that, yep, this is an okay situation that I can manage.
Nikki, what would you like to ask or explore on that part?
Oh, my mind is like popcorn right now. Corey, one of the things that I'm trying to be very politically correct here. So it's how would a teacher in the classroom with her or his or her young person, if they're seeing a repeated action of this. So I loved that scenario that you used, and I'm going to speak on behalf of the working parents, that would be me for my whole career, who I don't have the time. I don't have the time, and I needed to get to work. My young person might not have told me how they feel. What are ways constructively that a school or that we could work with the school to begin to address the exact scenario that you talked about? Because and maybe it's my mother guilt speaking here, but I think, and the reason for this question is, I've got a great example of particularly those masking students or those students that don't want to say something. And I remember a conference I was just recently running, and a principal came up and said, we would never have known what the underlying issue was for this young person until we actually began to get longitudinal data and we could see what's happening for this young person. And it showed us on Wednesdays and Fridays that this young person was so distressed when they arrived at school. And when we sat down with mum, it was because mum had to be at work early and she had a meeting and she had to be there and she didn't do her normal things. So that sort of hand over into the school environment. Yeah, that's probably a very complicated one, but I think it's a very common occurrence between school and home.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really important aspect of the monitoring and getting data. We can't presume what's going on here. It's so easy to miss the mark. And again, particularly for children, like we said, they're just learning constantly and trying to take in and interpret just so much stuff. It's impractical, it's impossible for them to be running through us every single interpretation they're making to see if it's right or wrong. So a lot of it's just being laid down, and the I think the best way to start here is to be doing that monitoring, and monitoring is a massive part of what we do clinically to get started, but also to measure change. Looking at just what you've described, looking for patterns and looking everywhere for those patterns as well, because it might be, using another example, it might not be for another kid about mom having to get to work. It might be that, soccer practice runs late the night before, and so dinner is really light on, or sleep is impacted, and so it's harder to regulate themselves in the stress of the morning when our rhythms are disturbed in this way. So that monitoring is really important to start identifying those patterns and then to start feeding it back, including to the young person. They may not be aware of this either, why Wednesdays are so challenging. And once we get that information, then we're in a position to start seeing how we can improve it.
And that's a really interesting, sorry, Jenny, I'm just going to jump in there. It's a really interesting, we always say, learning can't start if we haven't got wellbeing right. And I wish there was another word for wellbeing, because I feel like it's just this big word now. Like even though I've been in the industry for a long time, but when I'm working with schools or if I'm presenting and we're talking about it, and I said, oh, Jenny, how is Timmy in term 1 on week 3, week 5, and week 7 on Mondays and Thursdays? Because I can see that his attendance was partial or blah, blah, blah. If we don't have that real-time monitoring, and I think monitoring is the wrong word, you've got to be very careful around that. If we don't have that feedback, your brain as a teacher, Jenny, can't retain all that information. And what we've seen, and one of the reasons we exist, is first and foremost, how can we have a common language? So if we go back to that language piece that we were all talking about, we're expecting our teachers to be able to deliver consistent language and explicit teaching around emotional literacy and self-regulation and, adaptive cognitive behavior exercises. But how do we have a whole school approach? And I think that's where technology really is. It provides so much support for a whole community, because it's not something every teacher should have to do on their own. but also we should have a common language around language. We should also be able to see, and today particularly with safer technologies for schools and the schools owning the data, it stays within the school, but we're then being able to get, we make up that this person who's having problems going to school is called Timmy. So if Timmy's having issues on Wednesdays and Fridays and he's got behavioural incidents, we're able to get under the hood, we're able to engage families, we're able to get more information, and we're no longer just reporting on behaviour incidents, but we're also able to put in strategies as well, and strategies for on Wednesdays and Fridays. It might be that Timmy loves going to the library for a little while just to chill out, and he loves the librarian, but we can begin to prepare him better for school and set him up for better success, so he doesn't end up being that child that is seen for that behaviour. And I think the information, when I look at the information that most schools have, like they'll say, we have a lot of anxiety, and I'll say, show me, show me, and they'll show me their behaviour reports, or they'll show me their incident reports, or being able to use student voice and begin to build that out and have that as part of the equation of their attendance, their behaviour, their teacher's observation is invaluable to be preventative and to be able to address a young person. And I think we've seen, just a massive shift in the way that families are connecting, parents are connecting, and using student voice when we are looking to have really strong engagement with schools. Because as a mum, I speak as a mum now, it's really hard when things don't, when your little person's suffering or when there's things going on. And I think that connection to school and that family engagement is critical for the support of our young people as well.
So we've got some really interesting comments around technology, around food, around health. Where does that sit into our conversation today? Take me on that journey.
I'm going to flick to Corey because I just talk nonstop.
Look, all of our evidence shows time and time again that sleep, diet, and exercise forms the foundation to which everything else kind of sits on top of. And I know that they can be, they get a lot of eye rolls in my clinic when we talk about it. And I know it's hard to adhere to practices that support sleep, diet, and exercise. But, as an example, if we don't have regular and reasonably healthy eating, and if we're not getting an adequate amount of sleep, then our moods are affected and we need additional resources to manage the demand of our day. And as we spoke about before, anxiety is our additional resources. That's what gets kicked up to help us perform if we're otherwise, under aroused to perform. So, those things are just invaluable. And, if there's one thing that someone goes away and tries to change for their own lives, for their children's lives, or, to promote to their students that, can have a real difference to everyone, it's an across the board thing, that's sleep, diet, and movement. When it comes to technology, and I know that, technology use can be quite divisive. My clinic is a tech clinic, and, I know Nikki is the same. So without, showing that the bias too much there, I think that there is a great place for technology. I think that, like Nikki has demonstrated, there is a lot of learning that can be done at scale through technology, and we know that it is, an interest for many, many children. And so it's a way of meeting children where they are as well, to enable them to get that education and to practice things. My clinic's a virtual reality clinic. We literally put kids in virtual scenarios so that they can safely practice things that they're scared about to build their self-efficacy before doing it in the real world. So I'm not an anti-technology person. My teenagers will tell you a different story because I will often refer to YouTube as the devil. But I do think, everything in moderation, but, where are we getting all of our otherwise needs met? There's nothing wrong with technology. And obviously it does provide a massive opportunity for transferring information and education.
I think just on the back of that too, technology used and defining guidelines and boundaries around its use is really critical. And I won't go over the impacting factors that you covered off so beautifully, Corey. But I will share that, tiredness, out of over 4 million check-ins that we had last year, tiredness was one of the biggest things that we saw. And I won't unpack why I think check-ins alone are not enough. Like there's, I think again, the word wellbeing and the word check-in, both of those probably need a reframe. But one of the things that the system Life Skills Go does is digs into why. So really having a look at, again, those patterns, times, what's happening, cohorts. And I can't tell you the amount of times we've heard from schools that, they'll go, we would never have known that there was a group of ex-students getting up in the middle of the night and playing Fortnite and coming to school and falling apart and not being able to stay awake. And the parents had absolutely no idea. No idea. I think that when we are, and there's a whole lot there that we can't believe over there, but I wonder, and I think this is a kind of a global wonder. Our young people are living in a world we didn't grow up in. And we started our conversation before the webinar started on the importance of connection, deep connection, being seen, that really that impact on how do we see each other, that feeling, having that place where we're safe. And with young people on technology, and I'm speaking from the school's point here, when we are limiting, we might not be on technology all day at school, but coming back to those connections, coming back to really seeing each other, coming back to sharing how we feel. There's a school in Western Sydney that has been embedding Life Skills Go for over 8 years. And one of the questions we get asked regularly is, do the young people go up and register how they're feeling in front of people? Like, don't they think that that's kind of, aren't they ashamed? And the deputy of that school always says, we've created a culture where young people feel really great about sharing how they feel. And if they're not feeling so good, we've also taught a lot about empathy. So they get a lot of support as well. And I think, to me, if we can take more of that, and develop more of that, because we see a lot of that missing today. And I know, Corey, you and I have spoken, particularly for those young people, but teaching through play without rewards, teaching those values-based, teaching how we're feeling, being able to have those experience and playing through social games, and not these games, but physical games, and really, being able to use that as a new experience for some. And particularly, we've seen it this year for our COVID cohort that have entered into the school system this year that might not have had some of those frameworks as they were going through so many lockdowns.
So what I really heard in here, there's a couple of key things, and I'll use the term that I use is good use of human tech. And often we talk about tech and kids get really excited because they value this technology with the algorithms and the smarts that are behind it. But the human technology is extraordinarily smart. And when we get the best use of turning on human tech, as in our communication skills, our emotions, those things that you've talked about today, and when we get technology giving us some cues, some insights to know how to turn on human tech, whether it is those virtual environments that you've talked about, Corey, and simulating that experience so we can practice those feelings and feel them, or Nikki, whether it's getting some data to show us things that we would not have connected together. I'm really taking away from this that each school has the ability to really pull in those pieces that help them get more informed, to create their own version for their own community, the way they want to have these conversations, the way they want to model it, and the way that they create their own culture around this in that community, to feel heard, to feel connected, and to be in a trusted space is really sort of some of the core ingredients I've taken out of today's session, rightly or wrongly. What are your thoughts on that?
I think just, that coming off the back of Nikki's story about that school, you know, being able to also teach kids how to be there to connect with other kids, you know, turning on that human tech for each other at that level is so valuable. Again, we know that kids respond to peers increasingly than their family group. So as part of this education, you know, the fact that it is going out widely there to other kids and then they can be there to support each other, I think is a really wonderful thing.
So I've got a couple of explicit questions here I'd like to share with you, if that's okay. We've got here, how do we support students who are masking or displaying compliance behaviour, avoidance and perfectionism?
Oh, that's straight to Corey.
Well, you know, as we were describing before, you know, there's a number of different behaviors that come out when we're feeling anxious, and those behaviors tend to serve the purpose of, you know, neutralizing the perceived threat or trying to find a sense of safety. And you know, they are often, you know, in the short term, pretty effective. You know, they get the job done in the short term, and then they become quite maladaptive for the individual in the long term. So what I would say is that, you know, in any of those anxious behaviors are ones we want to understand, you know, how are they serving that individual? Because they're not being repeated because they're unhelpful. They're being repeated because they're serving some sort of purpose. We want to understand what that is, and then we want to make them more adaptive, you know, and in doing that, it's about trying to find a different place of safety that we can appeal to. You know, if a child is masking, it's because they are feeling, as a generalization, you know, they're feeling like they have to do that to be socially safe, that they're having to do that to avoid certain consequences, punitive consequences if they were to be themselves. So, you know, it's a broad question, you know, but you know, it does require building that up, building that individual up, making sure that they are able to feel safe without those behaviors. But the caveat is that the environment must also be safe, right? It's not enough for us to tell a child that they are safe without those behaviors if actually the environment is not safe or appropriate for them. So that's where the school part does come in.
There's
And I
a,
think it's sorry. I think there's an interesting thing there, because when schools begin to implement Life Skills Go, the majority of our schools know a Timmy. Where's Timmy? He's up the tree throwing rocks at people. You know, it's kind of those with really overt behavior. But what begins to happen over the first week or two is it's the ones that they had no idea about. So, you know, Life Skills Go provides a safe, you know, anonymous place for young people to begin to express how they're feeling. And within that, it's not going to the whole cohort, it's not, you know, it's going to the teacher. But over time, what happens, particularly for masking students who've been regularly doing it, and I'll interject there, just interject myself for 1 second. There was a story in the early days when we were developing the platform with the schools, and this young person, the teacher went over to the young person and said, Timmy, you're checking in angry every day, but you don't look angry. And he said, I just wanted to know that you were looking. And the reason I say this is because the other side that we begin to see is those masking students, and just like piggybacking off the back of what you just said, Corey, that sense of being seen and that sense of safety. You know, Dan Siegel talks a lot about, you know, if we really see a young person, they begin to feel safe, secure, and they begin to self-soothe. What we hear continuously is that masking student, when they begin to feel trust, will begin to share how they are feeling. And that trust and that relationship begins. And that's, you know, again, I'm not, it's very broad brushstrokes here, but we just see it time and time and time again.
I'm just noticing, Nikki, that we're bang on 8 o'clock and we're talking about keeping to time, but we've really got some very rich and really important questions that are here. And we made a commitment at the beginning that all of those questions would be answered through some email communication or something else. I just don't feel like we've got time to get to some of those that I can see there, but I love them and they're very
Me too.
So Nikki, can you just recap for everyone 2 things for me? One, what can they expect and when? And then the second thing is the importance of the survey, because you've got this community here and you've got a wealth of knowledge and experience and problems that we can all lean in and share from. Can you talk us the relevance of the survey so they can participate in that, and then how they can connect to get the
Yeah.
support they're looking for?
Thanks so much, Jenny. So I'll start with the survey. You should just pop the survey into the chat now. This is National Check-In Week is a national initiative, and people like Corey, I just want to say a huge big thank you for giving your time so generously to be part of that education, but bringing voices together around how do we work together? You know, we're in this period of time right now where everything's sort of changing. We're at this, I think we're at a point where there's opportunity as well to do things differently. And we need to work together. That survey is really important, that we want to hear. We've got people from all over Australia and New Zealand tonight that have registered. What is it within your community? What do you need more of? How can we support you more? So that survey will be there. Back to your question around what next. We will have out the recording of this. This is a recording that you can share amongst as many people as you want. You might want to share it with your PNC, with other colleagues, other educators. We will have that out to you within 24 hours. We will have some information in there. We'll also have Corey's details. We'll also have some emotion cards that have really talked about, you know, the things that Corey and I have talked about this evening around, you know, being able to explicitly teach young people and have practice and visual cues. And that will be out within the next 24 hours. And we also have a very large amount of events happening throughout term 2. And Corey will be coming and visiting us again, which I'm very excited about. And I also just want to, at this point, say thank you to Jenny, and also to behind the scenes, all of our ambassadors and partners. There's a lot of staff and a lot of team members that worked really hard to bring this event together and to bring this webinar together. And I just want to say a huge big thank you. We will keep those questions. So back to your first point, Jenny, we do download all of the questions. If your name's next to them, if it's a really, really big one, we will try and get back to you, or we will summarize tonight's and try to bring those questions into our responses from the summary of this webinar this evening. And I'll pass back to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Nikki. There's one piece here in particular that we haven't addressed. I'm just going to put it on the table for us to have a quick discussion, is the support for teachers themselves. We know that those that are tired, exhausted, typically have more students that need more support if they're in certain areas. We don't have time clearly to unpack that. I just want to put it on the table and acknowledge, firstly, for everyone turning up. Thank you so much. And secondly, I feel like there's an opportunity, Nikki and Corey, for us to explore support for teachers that are feeling helpless, underprepared, under-supported. My words, no one else's. But I think if we're not supporting them, then we clearly can't support these kids that we've talked about today. So I'm just going to put that on the table for a conversation piece for another day, but I think it's really important. So Nikki and Corey, thank you so much. And to everyone that's out there that's given up your personal time tonight, thank you for caring. Thank you for connecting and leaning into the opportunity to learn some more. I think this is a great initiative, Nikki and Corey, so thank you for your time. And I wish everyone a good night, and just remind you of all those resources that are coming out and the access. And this is an extraordinary, started off with this session, really looking at building resilience, helping students overcome anxiety and thrive. I think we got into some nuts and bolts today, but also great scaffolds for people to lean on. So enjoy your evening, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Nikki, I'm just going to stay on here quietly, and I'm personally open to anyone else asking a question or two if they'd want to, and then we'll see where you want to take it from here.
I'm here too. I'm not running away. So I felt so guilty because I don't think one single person left throughout the whole it was just stable the whole webinar. And I know that I was captivated throughout the webinar, and your knowledge and the way that you deliver information, Corey, is just absolutely beautiful. It's really, it's tangible and it's actionable, and it's really easy to understand and metabolize.